Welcome, everybody. I'm Brian Moore, Acting Lieutenant for HMS Psyche, and I'm here today to present to you the Blunderbuss, which we have right here. I'm going to give you a brief explanation of what, or rather who was using it and how it was being used. Rather than getting into a lot of historical details and the firing of it, I just want to give you some interesting things that you may not already know or may not be able to find on Wikipedia. And then after that, I'm going to just walk you through how we would use this on HMS Psyche during a reenactment in our funny clothes with live black powder. So for the moment, everybody should be muted, and I'll just ask to get everyone to double check that they are. And we'll carry on like that until the end of the presentation. I'll allow people to unmute themselves. You'll have to manually unmute yourself to allow yourself to speak, and then you can ask your questions. So if you permit me, I will get started by giving you a brief overview how, or rather the uses of Blunderbuss. So I had a book here just beside me as I started, and from that book is a great little quote that describes pretty much exactly what the Blunderbuss was intended to do. It was born of a man's insatiable appetite for splattering his fellow man, and that's a little gory and garish, but at the same time, it is an apt description. So initially, the blunderbuss actually started out as a cavalry weapon, and you can see some pretty dated examples, wheel locks, but still with a lot of the distinctive features that we see when we think about a blunderbuss. They were there was pistol form, and then there was the larger long arm form, and you can see these examples here, and that was really to help the cavalry be able to load the firearm faster. The flared barrel actually lets you get your ramrod in there a lot easier when you're on a pitching horse, lets you reload a little bit faster. So it was actually an ideal weapon for cavalry. And thanks to Mr. Lieutenant Wand, he dug up a great little anecdote about George Washington during the American Revolution, who actually asked Congress to issue blunderbusses to the American cavalry instead of carbines. Unfortunately, he was overturned. But that's one of the early uses for the blunderbuss and where it sort of came from. We also see at the end of the 17th century and early 18th century its use on the roads for the Royal Mail Service. And this became very prolific in England, because what happens after each war that England fought for empire is they released all these soldiers and sailors without pay or pension, and left them on their own when they were no longer needed. And this created a huge culture of highwaymen who would go out onto the roads and stop coaches and demand that they stand and deliver and give all of their money and goods, their passengers, their jewelry, everything like that. So the Royal Mail, who was running these coaches for the mail service, actually started to issue blunderbusses to its drivers. You can see here a contemporary image, and there's the blunderbuss right at his left side of the driver. There's some interesting surviving examples where on the very muzzle of the blunderbuss is written some interesting things. So here we have His Majesty's Mail, Manchester Mail, and of course, happy is he that escapeth me. It gives you a little sense of how serious these postal workers were at the time, and sort of how our postal workers could maybe benefit from examining the past a little bit. Also, in the same vein, because all these soldiers and sailors are let out without pay, they're out of jobs after each individual war. We're seeing a lot of the use of the blunderbuss as a personal defense weapon on the road. So anyone of the upper and middle classes who's traveling would have either a brace of pistols or a blunderbuss or both to defend themselves against roving highwaymen. And these are just a few different examples. We've got a dog lock ignition system. The other three are flintlock ignition systems. The one on the top left and the other two at the bottom there have spring-loaded bayonets. So at the very top of the bayonet, or at the very top of the barrel near the flint hammer, there's a little switch, and you pull back the switch, and that bayonet flips forward into a front-facing position, and it can become a very intimidating weapon. We also know that it was used very heavily in exploration, and particularly the Lewis Clark expedition is known to have several blunderbusses for the entire trip. They were mounted on the bow of their little boats there. And there's actually one surviving example that has provenance to that expedition. And you can see that it's got a hinged yoke that allows it to be mounted onto a stanchion or onto the rails of the boat. And you see that that's a prominent feature in some of the larger naval blunderbusses. We know for sure that the Navy did have them. It's not simply a movie fantasy. They were used aboard ship. At the beginning of the 18th century, there was actually a proportion of, I think, 2 blunderbusses for every 100 muskets aboard a vessel. That proportion would, I think, increase over time. But certainly at the beginning and middle of the 18th century, the blunderbuss had its heyday, and it grew from some of the smaller personal defense weapons to these very large wall and rail guns that had to be mounted on yokes. And some of the other examples from naval service are much more portable. They don't have the yokes, and they were clearly issued to the individual ship and carried as the ship, as part of the ship's armament, as issuable weapons. So these are not the officer's personal weapons. These are not something that an individual sailor would pick up and carry with him. This is something that's kept in the vessel's weapons locker in their armory, and issued only at times of battle or at times where there could be a potential mutiny. So often these might be kept very close to the captain's cabin or the quarterdeck, where they could be readily available in case of mutiny. And of course, another use of it is to have a bit of fun, but that's mostly for us. So what do we do with this in our modern times when we wear our funny clothes? Well, first, we've got something here that could potentially be loaded. So we're going to make sure that this is unloaded, and we're going to do what we call clear the weapon. We're going to remove the ramrod, careful not to put our fingers in front of the barrel, and we're going to lower the ramrod down. And you should be able to hear that distinct click. That indicates that there's nothing down there. It's hitting metal, it's hitting the base of the barrel, or the barrel plug. So you know that there's nothing down there. And then we're just going to check the pan to make sure that there's nothing there. And I'm looking, there's no black powder, there's no residue. You can turn it upside down and anything in there is going to fall out. But this weapon is unloaded and very clean, because I haven't had a chance to use it since COVID broke out. So now that we know that it's unloaded, we can have a look and get to know it a little bit better. It is a short barreled weapon, very, very short, and it's flared at the end to help facilitate loading. On a typical musket, there's no flare. The barrel is straight all the way down. But when you're on a pitching boat or ship and you're trying to load this, part of the procedure is to put all your powder and shot down the barrel and then ram it down. And it's a lot easier to do with the flared barrel than it is with a straight barrel, especially with the much longer brown bass musket, which I have here. So, in comparison, the blunderbuss is infinitely shorter, infinitely more handy, and in a tight space like a small boat, it works infinitely better. So on something like Psyche, where we have about 22 feet of boat to work with, this gets in and around the rigging and out over the rails, gunnels, a lot quicker than this massive piece here. And it's just generally easier to handle. And so it becomes quite obvious why this was something that was popular amongst seamen, sailors, and coachmen and cavalry when you're dealing with very confined spaces or where your platform is not necessarily stable. Let's put this guy away. So to go with the flintlock, we might have something like a cartridge box, which would contain black powder cartridges. And from the cartridge box, you would retrieve your cartridge, you bite the top off, spit it out, and then you pour a small amount into the pan, which is right there. and then you close the frizzen, and then you put the rest down the barrel. For reenactment purposes, we don't put anything else but the powder down there, but historically, you would load something like 8 or 9 of these little guys, anywhere from 36 to 50 caliber balls, in comparison to a musket ball, which is significantly larger. The musket is this one here at 73 caliber for a 75 caliber bore, and that's something closer to what we call buckshot. So you put a number of those down, and these are lead. They're not steel. They're not nails. They're not any garbage you can find on the boat, because typically you want whatever you're shooting out the steel barrel here to be of a softer metal than the steel barrel itself, so you're not damaging the barrel or wearing it over time. You might hear a lot of fantasy rumors about shooting nails and things like that. What they're actually referring to is language shot, which was something that was fired out of cannons, and it kind of looks like a nail, but it was a lead spike, a whole wad of lead spikes that were fired out like grape shot. That's not what you're using here. You're using a measured amount of powder and a measured amount of small balls, or even smaller than this, bird shot, little tiny balls to ward off your enemy at very close range. You probably wouldn't want to put something like a musket ball down there. That'd be easier to do that in a musket, but it wouldn't be ideal. It wouldn't get you the same effect. The barrels on these are quite thick, as you can see. And I can do this because none of you are actually at the end of the barrel. But because they are so thick, they can handle stronger loads. This particular model here was from was the discriminating general or military heritage. I think he's called Access Heritage now, but not the same guy as the guy who took over the original site. And this has been drilled. The touch hole is drilled, which is located right there. It's that little dark spot. So this is fully functional, fully operational, and has served me well for quite a few years. I really do enjoy using it. And it is a flintlock ignition, so we have a literal piece of rock or flint in the jaws of the hammer right here. It's screwed in with a little piece of leather or lead sometimes holding it in place. And that's a nice solid hold on that piece of flint, because what's going to happen is when you cock this all the way back and pull the trigger, it's going to swing forward that, and it's going to hit this at the same time. And when it hits that, it generates the spark. Steel or flint on steel generates the spark that ignites the powder in the pan. The powder in the pan, when it explodes, ignites the powder in the barrel and fires off the charge. Interesting feature about these reproductions, right here, we have what is the vestigial remnant of the Acorn motif, which I posted on this event's Facebook page. So originally, they often had this acorn motif, and this translated even into the military versions. Later on, after Captain Cook's expeditions to Tahiti and Hawaii, he brought back pineapples, and although pineapples were not foreign to Europe, he popularized them. And so later in the century, you see these finials becoming more pineapple in shape. Kind of an interesting influence of the Navy on the blunderbuss rather than the blunderbuss on the Navy. The other thing about this particular model, I've got a little flash guard right here that's useful for reenactors, but historically not accurate. You may have noticed I've got a sling on this thing. That would not be typical for any kind of shipboard vessel or shipboard weapon, but very convenient for reenactors. And in this book here, it does talk about the land versions of these, the civilian versions, and the mail coach versions of these having slings. And probably not sling swivels. It's probably an attachment similar to what I've rigged up here with a leather collar attaching to just a leather sling. I just made that myself, really easy to do. Other features on the blunderbuss, we've got an escutcheon on the wrist here. Sometimes you can see these carved, sometimes they're uncarved. And then on the other side, we've got another brass finial here to secure the lock plate with 2 screws. And it's completely unadorned. There's no carvings. There's nothing fancy about it. One, because it's a not mass produced, but an economy version of a reproduction. but it's also a reproduction of a military blunderbuss. So not a lot of fancy features here. And again, that's reflective of the civilian versions as well. They were primarily a utilitarian weapon, not intended to be your really fancy fowling pieces. These are quick personal defense weapons designed to look like what they're supposed to be, which is terrorizing and intimidating, and nothing more. And then just to get into how we would use these on HMS Psyche, like I said, we would go through the loading procedure, but some of the things that we take into account are we're on a boat that's moving up and down and left and right at all times. So the barrel has to be pointed in a safe direction at all times, which is usually over the gunnels and away from everyone else. And that includes when you're loading, when you're firing, and when you're unloading, and just confirming that the weapon is unloaded. And we would typically have someone amidships or in the stern sheets with a blunderbuss. We wouldn't put them up front because that's where our cannon is. And you don't want to mix two different kinds of firearms, particularly one that generates a spark next to the cannon, which has its separate magazine, which if sparks enter the magazine can generate quite a large explosion. There's a lot more powder in there than there would be in one of our cartridge boxes. So we try to keep these guys and muskets further aft away from the gun, where there isn't that much interference between the two for sparks. Also, the gun will generate its own sparks, and it will actually shoot up the quill, and you don't know where that's going to land. So we're going to try to keep these two things separate at all times. When we're firing, we generally fire in batteries. So the cannon will go first, and then the muskets and the blunderbusses will follow immediately afterwards. And if there's an opportunity to fire the muskets faster, we can do that, because some sites set out a time limit of 5 minutes between shots. So between those 5 minutes, we can get off a lot more blunderbuss and musket rounds. So we can do that to show that we're continuously firing. Just sometimes it's fun to fire everything at once off the starboard battery. So when doing that, whoever's operating the muskets and the blunderbuss and the cannons, they all let the skipper know, or the coxswain know, just so that everyone's aware that there's going to be some noise, there's going to be some smoke, and there could be some sparks coming aft. We also have to be aware of all the sails and the rigging. Our sails or canvas can catch fire from sparks, so we discourage you from firing these when you're underneath one of the sails. Sometimes we will be doing active engagements with our sails set. So we've got to make sure that any firing is happening on the windward side, so that you're not getting your sparks and everything blown back onto the boat or over the boat, or even towards a magazine. And then as well, just keeping the firing away from the sails and the ropes themselves, as well as the gas tank, is a modern convenience, but also a risk. So I think that generally covers off how these things were used and how we, as reenactors, apply them today. And I'm going to open it up for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away, or put something into the chat. I'm just going to.
So Ryan, I'm reviewing the chat box right now. And so one question from Kevin: what's the difference between a musketoon and a blunderbuss?
It depends on what you're reading. Some sources consider them the same thing. Others, it's very clear they know the difference. So some of the news reports that you read, and some of the other documentation that you read, it uses the term blunderbuss and musketoon distinctly. In others, such as returns of weaponry and things like that, sometimes you'll see musketoon, you won't see blunderbuss, and we're not sure which one they're referring to. But a musketoon would be a straight barrel musket like this, but substantially shorter. This is the sea service musket here, so it's already shorter than a typical Brown Bess, but a musketoon would be even shorter than that.
What was the effective range of a blunderbuss?
Similar to a pistol, you want to be this close, and there's a reason they gave these to the coach guys. The highway robbermen or the highway robbers would have pistols. They wouldn't carry a bulky musket or something like that. They had pistols. So they would have to get right up to the coachman to threaten him with the pistol. So ideally, you're within 10 feet, 15 feet maximum before you start to get a significant amount of spread. There's sort of two schools of thought on how to load this. One of them is to put a big wad of paper between the powder and the shot inside the barrel. That actually helps you tighten up the spread of the pellets. If you don't put that wad and you just have powder and then shot right next to it inside the barrel, a much broader spread, and it's going to be a lot less effective.
If I may.
Absolutely.
While we were doing some research on them for the Provincial Marine a few years back, we did come across one naval example that was written down, and the suggested loading was a double charge of powder, which I am going to assume, given that the standard musket loading was 120 grains of the powder that was available at the time, that would have been 240 grains, followed by 2 handfuls of rough shot or to the end of the barrel, then level and fire.
And that would be brutal. Yeah, thank you for raising that.
I wouldn't have wanted to be standing in front.
I've been next to one of these fired with 240 grains, and I actually lost my hearing for about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
My load is about 80 grains, just because powder is more expensive than lobster per pound. So I use 80 grains. It creates a great bang, and it's cost effective, but it's not going to hurt your hearing as much as 240 grains. If you're putting more than 200 into this, you're wasting powder and you're hurting your hearing, and you're hurting the hearing of everyone else in the boat. Don't encourage it, but
Well,
if you're on your own, give it a shot.
Our powder is significantly more powerful than what was available at the turn of the 18th century. So,
And it's a safe presumption also, their powder would have been single F as compared to double or triple F that we are currently using. So yeah, not as powerful. So,
And not as fast burning.
yeah. Question, were there both the steel and the brass barrel versions of the blunderbuss available to the Navy, or one was more predominant than the other?
The examples that I've seen are all steel barrel, but there's a few examples that have less connection to the Navy, more or less, that are brass barrel, and it would make sense that a brass barrel would be a good idea at sea, because if you've ever done any sailing in the Atlantic, the salt and the moisture in the air rusts everything instantly. So a steel barreled musket or a steel barreled blunderbuss is going to rust very fast if you don't take care of it. Typically, they would coat everything in pig fat or grease to exclude the moisture and the salt. That's one way of preserving their firearms and their swords and everything. The other way was Japanning, which is a form of blackening everything or lacquering it so that the steel is not exposed to weather. But a lot of the examples I've seen, either the Japanning has long worn off or it's not there.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? Anyone? If you're having technical difficulties, just put it in the chat. My computer's about 2 feet away or 2 meters away, so I can't actually see much.
I can read it for you.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
If I may,
Absolutely.
how many blunderbusses would typically be issued to, a ship like the Psyche, for example?
We don't know. I'm always looking for that kind of detail. I haven't seen a lot. Like I said, in this book, it talks about at the beginning of the 18th century, there was a regulated proportion of blunderbusses to muskets. But I'm not sure if that withstood the 18th century into 1812. I haven't found a lot of information on blunderbusses later in the century. That could just be me. You know, the evidence could be out there. I just haven't found it yet.
So 18th century, you mean the 1700s, or you mean the
At the
19th
beginning of
century?
the 18th century, there was a regulated amount, but later in the 18th century, you know, I don't have a lot of information.
Okay.
But we do know that they were used in the War of 1812. Jason from Provincial Marine reminded me of a specific example during the Battle of Lake Erie, where one of the officers fired up into the companionway and up into the hatch at oncoming boarders with a blunderbuss. Great effect. And we have some surviving examples in the Canadian War Museum. They're the kind with the yoke, but certainly we do know they were used during the War of 1812.
Sorry, yeah, that would have been when it was Robert Irvin during the capture of the Detroit and the Caledonia off of Fort Erie.
Yes, thank you. There we go.
And that is actually in the court martial records.
Were the blunderbuss shot from the shoulder or more from the hip?
I think Bill Wan has done a bit of research into this. I've got his little leaflet here, and you know he's got some recommendations that speak to that. Personally, I would find that would deplete your accuracy considerably. However, if you were to load this with 240 grains and fire it from the shoulder, you've got a situation similar to the Nock 7-barreled musket, where it might break your shoulder. So just looking at Mr. Wan's little pamphlet here. I can't find it quickly, but
hey, Ryan.
You could try it.
Ryan, can I add to that?
Please.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I was just going to say, in what I was reading was that there was, and this goes back to what Dale was saying about the amount of powder they had in the barrel. There was one lieutenant in 1812 that wrote what he thought was the proper way to fire a blunderbuss, and he was holding it at the waist. And his theory was that when you fired it, that you actually, and this sounds strange to us, but he would twist his body as he fired it in order to take out the recoil. Now you can imagine he would never do that, you know, in a line or anything like that, but that's what he suggested.
I imagine it'd be good advice if it's 240 grains you're putting down there.
I'm not so sure that would be good advice, actually. The best thing to do is to keep serious deep contact with whatever part of the body you're using as the anvil, because as soon as you start moving away, that the blunderbuss stock picks up full speed, and that's what's going into you.
Yeah.
There would be things that would make sense to us objectively and experientially. It'd be interesting to find more on the actual firing of it. So if anyone finds anything, I'd be happy to get that, and you know I'll post things as I find it as well.
Well, there's some interesting chat. Kevin states, pattern dates for British Ordnance small arms by Bailey shows issue sea service blunderbuss with steel iron barrels. And Ranger Ron says, I haven't seen reference to blunderbusses used by the US Army during the War of 1812. I presume you also mean the US Navy. I have many reenactor friends that always want to use them. As the National Park Service safety officer, I was always recommended against using them. Tremendously interesting group. And then from Daniel, oh gosh, all sorts of things coming in. The existence of a stock suggests that the intended firing position is to the shoulder. Basic design principles wouldn't waste the manufacturing process of a stock that wouldn't be used. So, and then Max, do you have a question? Rory says you might have a question. Unmute yourself.
I'll just respond to the comment about the U.S. forces. The blunderbuss was actually quite popular in the U.S. Navy. There are some examples, including in the USS Constitution Museum. And again, that's one of the yoke style blunderbusses. But I remember reading that they were used a bit in the North African campaigns in 1804. And I think it was 1801 to 1804 when they were fighting Tripoli and Algiers and those guys. So we do know that the U.S. Navy was using them, and there were New York manufacturers of blunderbusses in this book here around that time period as well. So they were producing them both for civilian use and for naval use.
And Max, do you have a question?
Hey, yeah, could you hear me?
Yep.
All right. So I was just I heard that's, well, you said that the blunderbuss was used as for cavalry and stuff. Was this even into the American Revolution and wars of 1812?
The cavalry by the American Revolution had largely gone to very short carbines. Like I said, George Washington recommended the carbines be replaced with the blunderbuss, but was overruled by Congress. So I'm not aware by that time of any examples of cavalry blunderbusses. That not to say that there might not have been some private use, but certainly the weapons that were issued to cavalry by that time were much more formalized and a very short musket carbine.
Okay.
Patrick has a question. Would a blunderbuss historically cost more to make than a rifle, or was it cheap to make like a musket? So into the economics.
That's a great question, and I wish I had the answer to that one. But clearly, there's far less woodwork in a blunderbuss versus the musket here, and there's probably a fair amount less steel as well. So certainly, in terms of labor, a blunderbuss would be slightly easier to produce.
So blunderbuss should be theoretically less expensive. Very good. Any other questions? Because we have 4 minutes and 37 seconds to go. Oh, yeah, more
Earth.
messages.
Can I comment on the, sorry, I'm gonna see, sorry, Ranger Ron's comment?
Certainly.
With the revenue cutter service, very little record still exists from the 1812 period. I've been trying to actually get some information off of the U.S. Coast Guard. They have very little information on revenue cutter service. If you look at the books, they tell you it did not actually exist till 1818. But I do have the account from the capture of the Cuyahoga with revenue cutter service. And I have received from the Coast Guard cutter plans leading up to the War of 1812, but the historian there is not really aware of a whole lot of basically the revenue cutter service prior to 1818.
Great. Thank you, Jason, for sharing that with us.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the records that I have turned up and the book I was fortunate enough to find here give a great deal of information, but there's a fair amount of gaps in what we know. And so I encourage everybody to go out and look around. When I originally started this research, my thesis was that, yeah, it's a great weapon, but it's a fantasy weapon relative to naval history. But I started to turn up a lot of this information I shared with you. So it's always nice to prove it wrong and actually find some of the records and some of the surviving examples. So always do your research. Experiential archaeology is great, but it's got to be backed up because they didn't think the same way that we think. So I encourage you to, if you find anything that I haven't thought of, or if I was wrong on anything, post it on the message boards or send me a message. I'm happy to learn more than what I know today, and I'm happy to aggregate all this information and share it. So I think just in the interest of time, we'll leave it at that. This video will be posted to our YouTube channel in a week. And Girth, what's our next session next 2 weeks?
Our next session in 2 weeks is all about food, about naval rations in the Royal Navy.
Fantastic. So I encourage everybody to turn out for that one. I think Girth's going to give a great presentation, and as he always does. Any questions at all on the blunderbuss or anything like that, just drop us a line. We're happy to talk. And So I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you for tuning in
Well,
and
hold
maintain
on.
a positive psyche.
Oh, Also, do visit our new website, hmspsyche.ca.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, no problem. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Have a good night.
Night.